But there's something about Van Gogh's legacy which is much more important than his fathering this or that ism of modern art. Vincent's passionate belief was that people wouldn't just see his pictures, but feel the rush of life in them.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most credible voice in true crime. Today we're going to go through Vincent van Gogh's letter to his mother, sent from Saint-Remy on a disputed date. It's either the 20th of February 1890 or the 19th of February 1890. Irrespective, it was around about 130 years ago today, give or take a day or two. On the same day, he also wrote a letter to his sister, so we're going to go through that as well. They're both fairly short letters, especially compared to the letters he wrote to his brother and to Albert Aurier. Before we get to the letter, if you're enjoying this coverage of the Van Gogh narrative, please subscribe to the channel, like, share, leave a comment. Please try to share with people who might be interested in this. I'm trying to get to at least 300 views a day. If it's less than that, then I think I'm just going to wait until the people that are interested come on board. So let's try and form a little community of at least 300 people. Otherwise, it's not going to be worth doing it on YouTube. I am confident that it's going to grow, but maybe not. Maybe the interest in Van Gogh's not that great. Okay, and so let's get started. Dear Mother, I intended to answer your letter many days ago, but I could not bring myself to write, as I sat painting from morning to evening, and thus the time passed. I imagine that, like me, your thoughts are much with Joe and Theo. How glad I was when the news came that it had ended well. It was a good thing that Will stayed on. So Will is for Wilhelmina's sister. I should have greatly preferred him to call the boy after father, of whom I have been thinking so much these days, instead of after me. But seeing it has now been done, I started right away to make a picture of him, to hang in their bedroom. Big branches of white almond blossom against a blue sky. And that particular image is one of Vincent van Gogh's signature pieces. It's one of his more famous artworks. Before I continue with the letter, I want to just kind of remind you what we are talking about. We are talking about a guy who's in an asylum. That's where this letter is written from. He's missing one ear, and according to everybody, he's mad and very troubled. And he's so mad and troubled that he's writing these two letters on the same day to his mother and his sister. And is there any gnashing of teeth and does he talk about any of his own misery in these letters? Instead, he's actually very humble. Instead of saying what he wants and what he needs and how horrible his life is, he talks about the honor of having his brother's child named after him. Something that he first said, well, don't you want to name him after our father? But then saying, it's really nice of you what you've done. And so now I'm going to paint a painting for this little newborn baby, and you can kind of hang it in his room. And so that's the kind of presence of mind he has. He's become an uncle, and he's already gotten to working on a sort of gift to give the child. Much later on in the story, we will be dealing with the same issue, that he's an uncle, his brother's got a baby, and there are certain expenses and duties associated with that. Let me burst a little bubble early on. The one theory is that Vincent van Gogh committed suicide because he was sort of aware of being a burden to his family in terms of, because his brother had a child, there wasn't really any space for him anymore, if that makes sense. So that's quite a well-known theory. Now, if you believe that, then just look at these letters, for example. He seems as happy as everybody else about the child. Anyway, that is something that you're going to, or that we are going to need to pay attention to, is, does he feel jealous about this newborn child? Does he feel envious? Does he feel, is there a lack of money as a result of this new addition to the household? Is he complaining to his brother that he's not getting enough money? Bear in mind, he's just been paid for the red vineyard. He's just been paid 400 francs. So, it's, one's got to see it in the right context. And so let's continue, going back to the letter. Bear in mind, this letter is written in Dutch to his mother, who lives in Holland. And the letter that he wrote to his sister Wilhelmina on the same day is written in French. And that's quite incredible. It just shows you also, not only is this a very intelligent guy, but is also, he can express himself quite succinctly in 2 languages. And how many people can say that? And again, if you say he was mad, are mad people able to express themselves very well in a second language as well? Anyway, let's go back to the letter. I thank you very much for the news about Cor. Okay, so Cor is his younger brother. Don't forget to give him my regards when you write him. I suppose you will be back in Leiden by now. So I should probably tell you that his younger brother Cor went to South Africa and worked kind of as an engineer, I think, on the railways in South Africa. I'll tell you a bit more about him as we go on. South Africa at this time, 1890, was a very young democracy, and it was sort of still trying to find its feet, just trying to decide whether it was going to be a British country or a Dutch country or its own country. And the fact that a lot of gold had been discovered was now making this an issue. Who is going to sort of, take the power of the country? But in any event, the country was building itself, and largely because of the mines, it was necessary to build railways connecting the mines to the cities, to the harbors. And so Cor was part of that process. Anyway, we will get back to his younger brother, but just think about it from the perspective of the mother who's in Holland. She's got one son in Paris, another son in the south of France who's going through a bit of a tough time. He's in an asylum, he's lost his ear, and then she's got another son that's in South Africa, and a daughter that's sort of traveling, to see her son in Paris. Okay, so back to the letter. I suppose you will be back in Leiden by now. These last days we have had rather bad weather here, but today it was a real spring day, and the fields of young wheat with the violet hills in the distance are so beautiful, and the almond trees are beginning to blossom everywhere. I was rather surprised at the article they wrote about me. Okay, and so now he's referring to the Albert Aurier review. And this is kind of why he's writing to his mother. I think he's felt a bit embarrassed about it, what has happened to him. He's feeling, there's been kind of a cloud of disgrace over him for quite a while. He's kind of the black sheep of the family. And so him writing this letter is almost kind of a knock on the door to sort of remind everyone, because he wrote his brother and his mother and his sister, kind of letting them know about this article, almost to say, okay, so you see, I'm not such a zwart skaap. A zwart skaap is well, I'm not sure if it's Dutch, but it's certainly approaching the language for black sheep. And he's just trying to let them know that he is, that he has done something, that's worth something. He's done something worthwhile. And I find it quite touching, that he's in his own corner and he's trying to get a little bit of credit from his family. So this is what he writes about the article. Now, bear in mind, he's just said something very modest about his brother naming his child after him, just saying, wow, it's such an honor. Didn't you want to name it after our father? Just that kind of modesty. And now you get that same kind of modesty about this article. He says, Isaacson wanted to do one some time ago, meaning someone else wanted to do a review some time ago, and I asked him not to. I was sorry when I read it because it is so exaggerated. The problem is different. What sustains me in my work is the very feeling that there are several others doing the same thing I am. So why an article on me and not on those 6 or 7 others, etc.? ? So it's quite interesting. Van Gogh says he was sorry when he read this review. He felt it was very exaggerated. And he was saying that the problem that he's facing in his life, the thing that's driving him, he says, is actually the fact that he's trying to do what everyone else is doing. And he'll talk about that in a second, but it's quite strange to read that. And it also kind of gives you a sense that being alone a lot is sort of maybe made him far too conscious of himself rather than sort of live and let live. I do think artists and writers as well, even when they praise, that they do want to be praised in the right way. I'll give you an example. When my true crime books are praised and someone says, well, there were no spelling mistakes, to me that doesn't really count for anything. What counts for me are the insights, which people very seldom refer to. People don't really review and say, well, you covered this which no one else has covered before, and be specific about it. Instead, it's sort of I didn't find any spelling mistakes, or it's sort of well written. Those are things you'd kind of just expect. The powerful stuff is the things that's unique to your work that is in no one else's work, kind of thing. So that is often how an artist feels, but you've also got to sort of be sensitive to the audience. They're just going to respond in a way that's natural to them. So here Van Gogh's actually kind of criticizing the reviewer, but he's also saying, he's also just reflecting his modesty. He's saying it's so exaggerated. I don't know whether he means the flowery style of Augier, which I found a bit grating as well. I mean, there is that aspect that is very exaggerated. But overall, I mean, it's an article that really kind of puts the wind in his sails. So he doesn't say, I was so glad that someone wrote about me. Instead, he's a little bit critical, and I don't think without reason. But as I say, what is interesting here is this thing about what's driving him is that others are doing the same thing. So he doesn't feel very unique. He doesn't feel very original. And the crazy thing is, 130 years later, Van Gogh kind of stands apart as very original. I mean, his work really feels like it has a absolutely singular fiery intensity. Isn't that right? And so it's strange that he feels that way about exaggeration about him. And that's also why I think if Van Gogh were sitting with us at the table or listening to this episode, and he had the opportunity to comment, he would sort of weigh in and say, you know what, I'm really appalled by what people think about me. It's not true, right? It didn't happen this way, and what people think about that's not quite right. And you know, if he's talking about something, that a review of him that's overwhelmingly positive, and he's criticizing it, you can imagine what he says about comments about his character and his life history that aren't true either. I do think all of that isn't something that exists in a vacuum. Van Gogh didn't only care about himself, he also cared about how his family perceived him and how what he did impacted his family, if that makes sense. So the way that he was perceived, irrespective of what really happened, it was quite important that that reflected well on his family, because he was from a family where his father's a preacher. So they were kind of a well-to-do family. Okay, so let's get back to the letter. He says, "But I must admit that afterward, when my surprise had passed off a little, I felt at times very much cheered by it. Moreover, yesterday Thea wrote me that they had sold one of my pictures at Brussels for 400 francs. Compared with other prices, also those in Holland, this is little, but therefore I try to be productive to be able to go on working at a reasonable cost. And if we have to try to earn our bread with our hands, I have to make up for pretty considerable expenses. The letter from you and Will has just arrived. Many thanks for it. I'd have written you before, but as I said, my head felt so little like writing because of rather hard work." So this is a really interesting paragraph. He talks about his own productivity keeping him from writing to them sooner, but the really sort of key insight here is you kind of have him admitting to his own evolution of feeling. So he's saying that although he was initially disappointed by the article, when his surprise had passed, when his emotions had settled, he actually felt quite, in his words, cheered by it. He felt quite moved and motivated and, he felt encouraged. And we can feel that encouragement just by his response. I mean, he's writing to everyone to kind of talk about it. But he is kind of doing it not in a braggadocious way. He's doing it in quite a humble way. And this particular letter is giving us a clear timestamp for when he sold his picture. And it was very recently. And so he's letting his family know, he's not going to be such a burden to them. He's just sold a picture and he's working hard. So he's trying to sort of let them know that, while his brother is sort of a success and has started a family, don't forget about me. I'm also getting there, I guess. But the reality is he isn't. He's missing an ear and he's sitting in an asylum. And I think the birth of his brother's child has certainly, and this review and the sale of the artwork, has certainly awakened him to possibilities and kind of gotten him sort of stirred up the life force inside him, where he's sort of aware, I think I need to get out of here and get back in it. I need to get back on the horse, kind of thing. Don't you get that kind of vibe from it? And he's talking about rather hard work, that he's painting so much that he doesn't have time to write letters. Again, you must bear all of this in mind under that whole assumption that isn't he supposed to be mad? Like, people that are very mad are kind of incapable of eating, sleeping, working. They just, So if you are going to say he's mad, I think you've got to admit that his madness is very mild. It's a very, very mild form of whatever his if you're going to say he's got mental illness, whatever it is seems to be very mild. Don't you agree? Based on this letter, based on what he wants to do, based on how he expresses himself. So, continuing with the letter, he says, "Now I am strongly inclined to take advantage of my good luck in selling this picture by going to Paris to visit Theo. And thanks to the physician here, I shall leave feeling calmer and healthier than when I came. Trying how it goes outside a hospital is perhaps only natural, though work may perhaps be more difficult when I'm free again." So there's some really interesting reflection from Van Gogh on his own situation. And, as I said earlier, he is trying to take advantage of this sort of groundswell of sort of positive news. It's not just one sort of positive element. It's not just that he's gotten this good review. It's he's gotten a good review plus he's sold an artwork, which is huge for him. And then it's also what's going on with Theo in Paris, right? It's also what's going on with Gauguin in, I think, Antwerp. He's also, and in Denmark, he's also having sort of successful exhibitions. So he wants to kind of get back out there. And he's telling his family this. He's saying, this is what I want to do. He kind of needs the goodwill, the blessing of his family so that he can leave. Not so much their permission, but he gets kind of a salary, like a stipend from his brother. So he kind of needs his family's blessing that when he leaves the asylum, they will continue to give him, monthly allowances. Of course, if he leaves the asylum and he's not well, and he's going to cause trouble again, then they're going to not be very happy. That's kind of the situation. So he's trying to curry goodwill from his family, and he's reminding them that he's made a few little, forward steps in terms of progress. In terms of his own physical well-being, he says, "Thanks to the physician here, I'll be leaving feeling calmer and healthier than when I came." So he's saying, you know what, when I leave here, I'm going to be fine. And so that's how he's already giving himself kind of a clean bill of health in February. And then he adds, he says, trying to see how it goes outside of hospital is only natural. He's kind of trying to sell the case to his family that, you know what, I think, isn't it only natural that you should try to see how it goes outside of a hospital? Like, try and make it out there, He's trying to not twist their arm, but just sell that little thing that, maybe I should be allowed to have another go, kind of thing. And then he sort of adds, almost just to be, not to be arrogant, he says, though work may perhaps be more difficult when I'm free again. So he's sort of second guessing himself a little bit there. Now again, if you imagine Van Gogh as mad, would he have these reservations? Wouldn't he have rather delusions of grandeur where he'd say, "Hey guys, I've sold my artwork, I'm out of here, woohoo, here we go." He's not doing that. He's very thoughtful. He's very measured. Do you see that? And then the final paragraph of his letter, he says, "Well, let's hope for the best. It is curious that my friend with whom I worked for some time in Arles should want to go to Antwerp, and that way I should be a little nearer to all of you. But I'm afraid this is not quite practicable. Also because I think it would be more expensive, and when one is used to the climate here, perhaps one's health might not be able to stand being back in the north. But I will begin by trying it in a few weeks in Paris. And embrace in thought your loving Vincent." So he says quite a lot in that last paragraph as well. It is referring to Gauguin. I think the Americans refer to him as Gauguin. There's just a little bit of a difference in pronunciation. The French pronounce it also even different to the way I do. But you know what I'm talking about. So interestingly, he refers to Gauguin, but not by name. He doesn't write out his name in this last paragraph, but he talks to his friend, and he talks to his friend wanting to go to Antwerp, which is quite close to where his mother is. And then he seems to be suggesting that if Gauguin is there, he might be there too. But then he again hedges that, and he says, well, it's not going to be very practical because that might be more expensive. So you can see how he's sort of feeling the waters. He's sort of communicating kind of what he wants to do, but he's also admitting that he's aware of the financial aspect to it. And that is a major driving force in Van Gogh's story, are the finances. And it's kind of quite misunderstood. It's quite misunderstood what was really going on. People thought of Van Gogh as penniless and so on. He wasn't quite penniless, but he was also not well off and comfortable either. But we'll get to that. So let's go quickly to his letter to his sister. Some sources have this as written the same day, on the 20th of February. Others have both letters written on the 19th of February. Anyway, that's the ballpark. So this was a letter written to Wilhelmina van Gogh, his sister, from Saint-Germain, and he writes, "My dear sister, many thanks for your last two letters, the one dated from Paris and today's. I am touched by what you write further about Jo's confinement. How very brave and very good you have been, staying with her all the time. In those circumstances in which we feel the strain of anxiety, I should probably be much more than you, like a frightened wet chicken." So he seems to be talking about the anxiety around, I think the little baby was born a little bit ill. And so he's saying he would have been like a frightened wet chicken worrying about what was going on. So a little bit of sense of humor there, but also he's expressing empathy with what's going on with his sister. Notice the kind of different tone with his sister as to his mother. With his mother, it's quite measured and quite respectful. To his sister, it's sort of more like writing to a peer, right? He goes on, and it's kind of more casual. He goes on to say, well, the result is that after all that, the child is there, and also I shall write a letter to mother telling her so. A day or two ago I started painting. It's possible that I shall send it soon, at least I hope so, toward the end of March. Tomorrow or the day after I shall try to make the trip to Arles again as a kind of trial, in order to see if I can stand the strain of travelling out of ordinary life without a return of the attacks. Okay, so this is some wonderfully specific information from him where he's saying, he's kind of letting his sister know he's going to leave the asylum and he's going to do a short trip to Arles and back. And that's going to kind of be an experiment to see if he can handle traveling. So he's kind of giving notice to his family that he's already preparing to leave, right? He's not leaving, but he's kind of getting ready. When he writes about his own affliction, he refers to attacks, and that sounds like something like seizures, doesn't it? It sounds like it could even be an anxiety attack or a panic attack, but it seems almost like something that is in the mind that takes hold of him, right? Does that sound like madness, or does that sound like some kind of physical thing manifest in the brain? If that makes sense. So if you think of something like epilepsy, epilepsy is not madness, it's also not mental illness, but it's a physical situation that occurs in the brain, right? It's a brain malfunction, if we can put it that way. And of course, brain malfunctions are exacerbated by stress. So it seems to be something caused by or happening in the mind, right? And if stress is causing it, then it has that almost that appearance of madness. But you can have a heart attack from stress. That doesn't mean you can have a bad heart and have a heart attack from stress, but equally you can have a good heart, You can have a strong heart, and any heart can be overwhelmed by enough stress. The same is true with the mind. So back to the letter, he says, perhaps in my case it is necessary to fortify my resolution not to allow myself to have a weak head. Right? Let's just go through that again. He says, perhaps in my case it's necessary to strengthen my decision not to allow myself to have a weak head. So he's kind of saying he needs to buck up, he needs to pull up his socks, he needs to pick himself up by his bootstraps. So he's saying he needs to have a strong kind of mental constitution, and obviously one thing that can weaken one's mind is drinking, and that was something that he did. He drank quite a lot of absinthe. So he's also letting his sister know, I'm trying to get a hold of myself. I'm trying to sort myself out, right? He's not talking here about treatments or medicines or whatever. He's kind of saying, it's up to him. He needs to be strong, right? Then he adds, naturally, in consequence of continual brain work, an artist's thoughts get somewhat exaggerated and eccentric at times. So here he's kind of linking his brain to the chaos of an artist's thoughts, which one can be forgetful, one can be, all those things associated with art, but I don't think that can be associated really with mental illness. And then he talks about the article by Albert Aurier. He says, I thought the article by Mr. Aurier, leaving out of consideration whether I deserve what he says of me, very artistic and very curious in itself. But it is rather like this that I ought to be, instead of the sad reality of how I do feel. I wrote to tell him that in any case it seems to me that Monticelli and Gauguin are more like this, that it seems to me that the part which should be assigned to me is of a very secondary order. So this is another version of what he's saying to his mother. It's kind of similar. It's not quite the same though. But he's basically saying he doesn't really feel worthy of Mr. Aurier's praise. And he seems to sincerely think that, which I think is quite, it shows the humility of Van Gogh, but maybe also the insecurity of the artist. Maybe that he doesn't think enough of himself or of his work. And yet, in a way he does. In a way he does stand up for himself when he talks about the exaggeration. So it's quite interesting how Van Gogh is kind of quite hard to please. He's, in this sense, as I say, he's quite insecure. He says, the sad reality is I ought to be like that, but I'm not. And he's saying, the other artists that are sort of, deserving of that. And maybe he feels like that because he hasn't sold many works yet. Maybe he feels like he's still becoming. But we can see he's very in awe of other artists, and he's very much kind of in that pattern of a work ethic. He's working very hard at his art to try to get somewhere. And then he continues, still referring to Aurier. He says, the ideas he speaks of are not my property, for in general all the Impressionists are like that, are under the same influence, and we are all of us more or less neurotic. So that's also really interesting, where he's saying, I shouldn't be singled out, which I don't agree with. I think if a reviewer or a critic does single you out, take it, especially if it's praise, because it so often isn't. So, but he's basically saying, you know what, I'm not that special. And maybe he feels embarrassed because he hasn't sold that much art. Don't praise me until I'm kind of on track, kind of thing. It is interesting that he uses the word neurotic, where he says, and this is a self-diagnosis, he's saying, all of us Impressionists are more or less neurotic. Now, the proponents of mental illness will love this word. They'll say, neurotic is mentally disturbed, mentally ill, mentally deranged. And that's at the one end of the pendulum, of the spectrum. The other end is kind of milder. To be neurotic, you can also be unstable. You can be unbalanced. You can be maladjusted. You can be phobic or psychopathic. So, yeah, Van Gogh is kind of admitting to his own neurosis, and you can decide what you think that is. You can decide whether you think it's mental illness or whether it's just the normal instability, the normal sort of weirdness of artists. Being a little bit unbalanced in society. You have the balance in the art, but there's a little bit less, there's a little bit more social awkwardness. The opposite of being neurotic is being stable. So, like a stable person with a 9-to-5 job, someone who's married with children, someone who's well balanced. So he sees himself more as not necessarily all that well adjusted and not that stable, which is true. But the fact that he can diagnose himself doesn't show him being very mentally disturbed. I mean, how many mentally disturbed people say, "I'm mentally disturbed"? You've got to be quite stable and grounded to be able to say what's going on with yourself. Do you get that? Van Gogh goes on in his letter to say that this neurosis renders us very sensitive to colors and their particular language, the effects of complementary colors or their contrast and harmony. But when I had read that article, I felt almost mournful, for I thought, I ought to be like that, and I feel so inferior. And pride, like drink, is intoxicating. When one is praised and has drunk the praise up, it makes one sad, or rather, I don't know how to express it. I feel it. But it seems to me that the best work one can do is what is done in the privacy of one's home without praise. And then you do not always find it a sufficiently friendly disposition amongst artists. Either they exaggerate a person's qualities or else they neglect him too much. However, I should be pleased to be able to believe that justice is better done after all than appears to be the case. So, wow, he says a lot here, and he actually uses the word inferior. He says, I feel so inferior. He's saying, I ought to be like that. I ought to be like this powerhouse that the art critic is referring to. But I feel so inferior. And I think what he's acknowledging is his reality. He's sitting in an asylum without his ear, and he's kind of feeling down on his luck, and this review is kind of enormous. It's not just well done, it's talking about his legacy and all this kind of thing, and Van Gogh is feeling unworthy of it. And it's so sad because look where he is today. Look at what has happened to his legacy today. So if anything, the critics' praise wasn't worthy of the art, one could say. Van Gogh deserved a better review, or a better executed review. And yet his response is that he feels so inferior. He feels that he's not up to this review. And then he talks about pride. He says pride can be intoxicating. He says when one's praised and has drunk the praise up, it makes you sad. He says, I don't know how to explain it, but he says maybe the best way to do your work is just at home without praise, which is quite sad. And he talks about you can't always have enough of a friendly disposition amongst artists. This may be a reference to what happened to him and Gauguin, where was he not friendly enough when Gauguin was around? He also talks about either they exaggerate a person's qualities or else they neglect him too much. So he's saying, it's difficult to be praised because people don't really get it right. They either too effusive in one area, or they're not effusive enough in another, or they're neglectful in another area. But the fact that he's talking about it so much, you can see has clearly moved him. It's kind of unsettled him in some ways positively, and in other ways he feels he needs to match this praise. And if you want to make the case for suicide, you could say, well, he just felt he couldn't meet the expectations of what the world, or something like that. I don't think that's the case, though, because he is able to have perspective on this particular review. But it's definitely something that people who commit suicide do feel, is they are so competitive that they check out of the race. So one could see it that way. And then Van Gogh says, maybe he feels like his letter's been very sober. He says, one ought to be able to laugh now and then and to make merry a little, or rather very much. So he's kind of saying, he's kind of letting his sister know that he is kind of balanced, and he still does have a sense of humor. He's taken this review to heart, he's been very serious about it, but he can also have a sense of humor. Then he goes back to, in terms of the letter, he says, I think you were lucky to see Degas in his home. I'm working on a portrait. Okay, and then he talks about Millet and Delacroix. You can read this yourselves if you're interested. I'll put a link in the description. Skipping down, he says, thinking of this but far away, I feel the desire to renew myself and to try to apologize for the fact that my pictures are, after all, almost a cry of anguish, although in the rustic sunflower they may symbolize gratitude. Wow, that's really quite amazing. So he's talking about that he does have the desire to renew himself. He's trying to be born again. And he says he wants to apologize for the anguish in his pictures. And he says there is gratitude when he paints the rustic sunflower. So he's feeling anguish and gratitude, which is quite interesting. That's what he's saying he's feeling. He adds, you see that I do not reason well yet. It would be better to know how to calculate the price of a pound of bread or a quarter of a pound of coffee, as the peasants do. And here we are again at the same spot. Millet set the example by living in a hovel and holding intercourse only with people who did not know the bounds of pride and eccentricity. So rather little wisdom than a lot of energetic zeal. And for the rest, like all the rest, I hope to write you again before long. Keep in good health, mother too. I hope to do some portraits in Paris. Again, he's giving notice that this is what he wants to do. I have always believed that one learns to think by painting portraits. This is something the art lovers like least, but portraits are something almost useful and at times pleasant. Like furniture, one knows. They remind one of things gone by. I embrace you in thought. If the other sisters should also like to have some canvases, you can ask Theo for others, and you will select them according to your taste. Once again, the best of wishes and a cordial handshake. Yours, Vincent. Postscript. I should not be at all disgusted if some more pictures went to Holland, so you'll know this if an occasion arises. And interestingly, this letter was written in French. So all in all, there are around about 6 letters that were written in February, including to Theo and to Albert Aurier, and then not much happens. So there were a lot more letters in December 1889 and January 1890, and then a couple around this review in February, and then it kind of slows to a trickle. There are only 4 letters in March and 3 letters in April, and we will get to those when it's on those days 130 years ago, on the same day. So I'm sure you'll agree, from Vincent's letters we get a very clear sense of him. We do get a sense of there's a little bit of confusion or him being unsettled. He's not quite sure what to make of the review. But to be honest, when I read the review, and it's not about me, I find the review quite confusing myself. It's very verbose. There are little nuggets in it, but a lot of it is kind of over the top and it's not all that well written. And I don't think it's the thing Van Gogh deserved. Van Gogh deserved a proper thing without the flowery excess. Although the flowery excess does, in a way, say its own thing, which counts for something. If you head over to Patreon, I've just put up a post on the mainstream theory on John Benet Ramsey, which I think is quite interesting. I also covered the early letters to Theo on Patreon. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. The next episode, because there's going to be a long gap before the next letter, so the next episode in the series on Van Gogh, I'm going to look at the movie At Eternity's Gate, kind of in quite a focused way. We're going to spend a little bit of time on the movie, on Schnabel's interpretation, and then we're going to start looking at other films, including the movie about Gauguin and other documentaries and films about Van Gogh, and that's going to tie this between now and his couple of letters, just 4 letters in March. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys next time.